Welcome. I have the time of 5:15, so I'm just going to get started. Welcome to the Nonprofit Social Equity 2 panel. This is a follow-up to our Nonprofit Social Equity 1 panel this morning, in which Dr. Benenson and I presented a paper arguing for a framework that would hold together all this research that's dealing with social equity, social justice issues in a way that can create more knowledge growth and knowledge development. I wanted to do a special thank you to the Critical Perspectives CIG for this panel. Most of the people who joined the panel were from the Critical Perspectives CIG, and they've encouraged the panel all along, and that group has been a tremendous benefit to everything I've done at Arnova and to many of the folks who are on this panel. So I wanted to say thank you to all of the CIG members. Today we have three really interesting sounding papers. First of all, we've got a paper entitled Knowledge and Exploitation of Curricular Models as Western Hegemony, Refocusing Curriculum to Empower Communities. Roxanne Mirabella, the Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs at Seton Hall University, and Dr. Heather Carpenter, Associate Professor of Business and Economics at Notre Dame, not that Notre Dame, Notre Dame of Maryland University. We also have a paper called Pay Disparities Among American Social Workers in the Nonprofit, For-Profit, and Public Sectors. The two authors on that are the eminent Dr. Rong Zhao, Assistant Professor of Social Work at Hunter College, and Joy Zhang at Columbia School of Social Work, MSW candidate. And last, we have a very interesting paper called Structural Injustice in a Liberal-Leaning Organization, a grounded theory case study of the micro-foundations of a macro-level problem. And the two authors there are Dr. Jennifer A. Jones, Assistant Professor of Nonprofit Management and Leadership at the University of Florida, and Dr. Elizabeth Castillo, Assistant Professor of Leadership and Interdisciplinary Studies at Arizona State University. That will be the order in which the papers are presented, starting with Dr. Mirabella and Dr. Carpenter. And during each paper, I'll be holding the time with this stoplight. When you see the green light, that means you have 10 minutes remaining. At yellow light, you have 2. And then red light will mean that your time is up. I'm not going to yell at anybody. I'll just expect you to see that. Please keep me in the side of your screen. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Mirabella and Dr. Carpenter.
Thanks, Nori. Thanks for the reminders. So Heather and I are working on a paper where we're looking at the Western hegemony of nonprofit management education. Little is known about hegemonic and colonial knowledge production on the curricular content of universities in the majority world. We're going to try to use the term majority world and minority world. And we can talk about this afterwards and what y'all think about that. So where the majority world is where the majority of the people live, and the minority world is the rest of us who impose our will on the rest of the world. So we are looking to fill the knowledge gap that we think exists. And the paper begins with a discussion of the history of higher education in the West, where we find a clash of purposes. We draw on Kant, where he talks about the higher faculties who were meant to influence the people to the ends of government, and the lower faculty that occupies itself with teachings which are not adopted or adapted by directives of the superior. And we actually find through the years that this bifurcation continues. In the Humboldt tradition in Germany, where the first research university was formed, the research university was built around this notion of a faculty who looked at reason, a faculty who looked at knowledge production, and this cultivation of reason was a way to cultivate moral persons rather than reliance on those higher faculty that inculcated state-prescribed norms for education. And then when we shift to a discussion of the United States, this bifurcation over purpose in the 19th century was between those who advocated for classical education and those who thought that this type of education was totally irrelevant to success in the labor market, advocating for a curriculum instead focused on job skills and employment. Johns Hopkins University was the first research university in the United States in the Humboldtian tradition. But at the same time, Andrew Carnegie and other robber barons were advocating for a new kind of academic institution which focused on manual labor and job training. So the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute, as an example, was established primarily to train Blacks to teach in segregated Black elementary schools and also to continue their agriculture work on the farm. So in the paper, after we discuss sort of this historic tradition, we then move to the characteristics of higher education in the neoliberal age. So these are characteristics that are associated with the globalization and bureaucratization of higher education in the neoliberal age. And we talk about them in three parts: Anglo-centric content, college rankings, and accreditation. We also talk about how excellence has now become the watchword of the university, and it's become its unifying principle as it's become corporatized. And so, in addition, the minority world was able then to use this soft power of higher education and the soft power of excellence to sort of force the majority world to develop their universities according to the market model of excellence. In the Anglo-centric context, there's several reasons why this occurred. First, the leading exporters of higher education in the minority world are Australia, the UK, and the United States. Second, foundations from the minority world poured funds into higher education to promote higher education development in the majority world. Next, Anglophone countries were able to increasingly attract students, which became an important source of money as public funding dried up in those countries. And finally, research and scholarship has been primarily organized in the English language. The last two of the globalization aspects that we talk about are college rankings, which have become ubiquitous, and a primary evaluative mechanism for determining excellence, and accreditation, where this is a way for countries in the majority world to propel themselves in the top of the ranking. So Heather is now going to talk about the development of education, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, through a neo-colonialist lens. Heather?
Thank you, Roseanne. So in the majority world in Africa, higher education can be traced back to as early as 300 AD. And this time period before European colonization had higher education that was embedded in the cultural setting of the time. It was tended to be monastic, episodic, and religious-based, and male only. And this indigenous African knowledge systems and learning spaces, however, were disrupted over time. In some cases, they disappeared or they were destroyed based on wars that were going on over slave trades, and then with the European powers coming in and doing colonization. And this colonization changed the face of higher education on the content. The neo-colonial higher education systems that were created limited Africans' access to power, financial freedom, and true education. The institutions that were set up by the colonialists, as Roseanne mentioned, really limited the freedom of Africans and the indigenous populations. And those that attended the higher education institutions were only those that were willing to accept and implement the European and Western ways of knowing and thinking. The higher education systems during the colonial time were taught in non-Indigenous languages of English and French and Belgium. They limited Africans' academic freedom. There was limited curriculum, and the colonialists dictated which subjects would be offered and that would personally benefit the colonialists. Although Africans attempted to reject this formalized European model of education structures, after the African countries gained independence, which was around the 1960s, the power and money prevailed, and Africans turned back to the Eurocentric ways in trying to implement the Bologna process. And the Bologna process was a group of Europeans who came together to establish a set of higher education standards, such as the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degree. So before colonialism, the education included a variety of methods and time periods. Further influence on African higher education was the establishment of the Millennial Development Goals, and then further, you might be familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which focuses African countries as being classified as developing countries and needing outside Western influence. And similar to what Roseanne said, we see this continual trend of foundations and academics from European countries in North America traveling to African countries to impart their knowledge as as if it is truth on how higher education should be run, and knowledge only coming from the Eurocentric perspective. We also see disparities in who gets access to higher education in countries across the Africa continent, such as wealthy families, still very gender-based. And that is further influenced by the establishment of nonprofit education programs, which Roseanne and her team have studied. In 2007, there was approximately 50 programs. It's since quadrupled since that time, and all these programs are focused on development, on developing the economics and developing the country. So now I'll hand it back to Roseanne. You unmute.
Went to my notes before I unmuted, sorry. Okay. So at the end of the paper, we talk about indigenous ways of knowing and how we can, you're not going to undo what happened with colonization. You're not going to undo what happened with neoliberalization and globalization, but we have to recognize that there are other ways of knowing besides these minority world ways of knowing. So we talk about changing the attitudes about indigenous knowledge. We have to expose and eliminate the pejorative label of IK as primitive, which falsely claimed that Africa had no scientific or technological advances before colonists came in. We also have to change our education system, integrating indigenous knowledge into mainstream education and making it African-centered in the curriculum. Also supporting the development of IK institutes of higher education in Africa. Similar to what occurred with marginalization of women's studies and Africana studies in the minority world, we need to make sure that we don't relegate IK to an arts and culture learning area. It has to be integrated throughout the curriculum because you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And then finally, those of us who study nonprofits and development, if you would, we can do a lot about this. So we can use indigenous knowledge to solve problems in African communities. For example, when people from the North discuss the environment, we discuss it from intellectual curiosity, and indigenous knowledge folks discuss it from an ecological concern. The former implies the desire for knowledge to explain facts about the environment, while the latter wants to deal with the commitment to the feeling and the needs of the community. And so we need to apply indigenous knowledge in the development process. We have to tackle the foreign aid dependency syndrome, and we need to be suspicious of and cautious of IK initiatives that are developed by minority countries to assist those in majority nations. Thanks.
Thank you, and let's give some applause to Dr. Mirabella and Dr. Carpenter. Wonderful presentation. And now I will turn it over to our basically our meso level of thinking with the next presentation, losing that, by Dr. Zhao and Joy Chang.
Hi everyone. The paper my co-author Joy Zhang and me are presenting is Social Work Racial Pay Disparity across the nonprofit, for-profit, and public sectors. I hope my sound doesn't interrupt. Yeah, some background of this study. So we know that nonprofits, let me move this, below, yeah. So we know that the US nonprofit human service organizations are experiencing a workforce crisis with a record high staff turnover rate. And this crisis has significantly impacted the ability, this organization's ability to serve the pressing social needs of their clients. And social workers are a major component of this workforce, and a large proportion of them are employed in the nonprofit sector. However, little attention has been paid to the compensation of this female-dominated but low-paying profession. So some existing research have attempted to examine whether there is a sectoral difference in pay disparity, and there we identified two gaps of this literature. First, they mostly focused on gender rather than race. And second, even though human service workers only concentrate in a few industries, most studies include the entire economy in their analysis. And Sorry, I need to move this this video panel, whatever. Yeah. So our research to address this gap, we're asking this question: is the racial pay gap smaller in the nonprofit sector than in the public or for-profit sector? By racial pay gap, we are comparing the pay disparity between white social workers and social workers of color. Our literature review showed that social workers majorly work in private nonprofit organizations and government agencies, but there are also a significant number of social workers working in for-profit organizations. And social workers are predominantly female. People of color represent increasing proportions of active social workers. Social workers are very low paid, much lower compared to nurses and teachers, even though close to 50% of American social workers have a master's degree and about 82% of them are college graduate. With respect to pay disparity, existing studies found a significant gender pay gap between comparable men and women, but a few studies have examined racial pay gap among social workers. So the intrinsic motivation theory says that because nonprofit human service workers do the job in part to seek intrinsic rewards, and pay disparity hurts the motivation of intrinsically motivated workers. Therefore, nonprofits tend to reduce pay disparity between the workers. The labor market competition and institutional isomorphism argument said that if the nature of the work that the worker do is identical, and if there's a labor competition, this effect should be minimized. And therefore, there should not be significant difference in pay disparity between the nonprofit and for-profit sector. And lastly, research showed that union institution and pay transparency reduce pay disparity. And we know that a large proportion of government workers are unionized and their pay are publicly available, their salary. Therefore, we hypothesize that the racial pay gap does not differ significantly between the nonprofit and for-profit sectors, but it is smaller in the public sector compared to the two private sectors. To test the hypothesis, we used the American Community Survey 2013 to 2017 5-year combined data. We restricted our sample to full-time self-identified social workers working in 5 human service industries in the great New York City area. These 5 industries are hospitals, health services, elementary and secondary school, and social residential care facilities and social services. These 5 industries employed 92% of all New York City social workers. And this results in a sample with about 1,500 observations. Our model specification includes an interaction term of a binary race variable and a 3-category sector of employment variable. So why do we restrict the sample to New York City? As you can see in these tables, the New York City social workers population includes a significantly higher percentage of people of color, which makes the comparison more accurate. In addition, by doing so, we controlled the effect of state policies and regulations and living costs, etc. Here's the table of our descriptive statistics. I know it's difficult to read, so we summarize the major points here. Regardless of sector of employment, the average earning of white workers was the highest, greater than Black workers, followed by social workers of other races. On average, the earnings of government social workers were the highest, and for-profit workers' earnings were slightly higher than nonprofit workers. And government employed the largest number of Black social workers, while white social workers outnumber social workers of color in both the nonprofit and for-profit sectors. And nonprofit is the widest sector in terms of racial distribution. And government is the primary employer of social workers in New York City, employing about 40% of total social workers, followed by nonprofit and for-profit. Government social workers have more years of experience than nonprofit and for-profit workers, and this pattern is consistent for social workers of all races. And compared to government and for-profit social workers, a significantly higher percentage of nonprofit social workers held a bachelor's or master's degree. This is our regression result. Again, to summarize in English, first, within the nonprofit sector, white social workers were paid about 7% higher than comparable social workers of color. And for white social workers, there was no statistically significant pay difference between the nonprofit and for-profit sectors. However, for those worked in the government, they did receive about 8% higher pay than their nonprofit counterparts. For social workers of color, there was no statistically significant pay difference across the three sectors, even though those working in the government did receive about 4% higher pay compared to the nonprofit counterparts, but it's not statistically significant. And because of the significant advantage that white social workers gained by working in the government, the racial pay gap is larger in the government sector than in the nonprofit and for-profit sectors. So our hypothesis 1 is supported by, but our hypothesis 2 is not supported. Specifically, there was a significant racial pay gap between white and social workers of color in all three sectors. And the racial pay gap was about the same in the nonprofit as in the for-profit sector, but the racial pay gap was larger in the government sector than in the private sectors. The large racial pay gap found in the government sector is puzzling. One possible explanation is that racial hierarchy in the government sector is more rigid for people of color to overcome. We hope that future studies can take into account the effects of levels of position, union status, and other pay determinants, and thus form some accurate explanations. So from my past study and my dissertation, I did find that the higher industry or the higher an industry pays, the higher the pay disparity. Maybe that could also explain part of the reason why the racial pay gap was larger in the government sector. Thank you. We welcome your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhao. All right, so our last paper is Dr. Jones and Dr. Castillo. Let's give applause to Dr. Zhao and Joy Zhang. Nice work. All right, turning it over to you, Dr. Jones.
Great, thank you everyone. And Jenny and I will be presenting a paper of a study we did on social injustice in a liberal leaning organization. Let's see, slideshow. And why the need for this study? What the literature has told us is that for a long time, there has been racial inequity in the distribution of leadership in the nonprofit sector. The latest board source research from 2017 shows that CEOs are 90% white and similar numbers for chairs and members. And sadly, this has not changed very much going back for years, even though the issue has become more, people have become more cognizant of the issue. So we were curious about what is driving this lack of momentum in shifting these demographics. The possible drivers that we looked at were four, and these were drawn from the literature. One was on insular recruitment. So the tendency of people who are recruiting CEOs to look within their own social networks rather than casting a wider net. Another issue we looked at was resource dependency, so that resources are a driving factor for organizational decision-making and strategy. The third issue we looked at was moral licensing, which is a well-documented psychological phenomenon of a person doing something, they deem as morally good, paradoxically inclines them to potentially act more selfishly or against their social values in the future. And the fourth aspect we looked at was white identity management, which is where white people operating in a white dominant culture, the process they use to manage their identity. And the three components of the model we used were to deny, distance, and dismantle that identity. And the methodological approach we took for our unit of analysis was micro foundations. And what we like about this is that it is a multi-level holistic. So it looks at what are the individual actions and interactions that create this emergent property of unjust hiring practices. And it illuminates how these individual drivers combine, not through intentional action, but they create this effect of injustice. And it provides an explanatory power for how social aggregation patterns and higher level phenomena emerge from these individual actions. Jenny, would you like to take over?
Yes, so this is a grounded study. We were actually conducting an entirely different study And in sitting in on this board meeting, observed this pattern of behavior that just struck us as so incongruent. This is a board of directors that was very liberal leading. They had a Black Lives Matter sign in their window, and yet suddenly they had this hiring process for their CEO that actually was racist, not in intent, but racist in outcome. And so we're going, how did this happen? Where did we get from this great sign in the front yard to something that actually is the exact opposite? And so we used critical case sampling to take this case and say, okay, let's look at it deeper. It's one small liberal leaning organization. And the data we had were transcripts from 2 board meetings. We were actually sitting in on the board meeting when it was happening. And then also transcripts from semi-structured interviews with the board members. Most of the data for this paper ended up coming from one board meeting and the events that unfolded in the board meeting. And so we coded based on the literature review that we've done. And the literature review was obviously done after the data collection because we didn't realize we were collecting this data. And then we are currently doing a qualitative audit where other researchers are looking at our research decisions and giving us some feedback on that. So we're in that process right now. So just a quick summary, this is a small, rapidly growing nonprofit organization, generally human services, so they have an environmental bent to them, liberal leaning. They were co-founded by the current board chair and the program director. The program director was in the meeting at the time and is very active. And in this particular board meeting, the board chair advised the board that she would suddenly have less time to give to the organization. She had been in a founding role, she had been very involved, and suddenly her outside commitments were going to pull her away. She presented an overall staffing plan, which included plans to hire a program coordinator and then their first executive director. She presented a budget, and then she called for a vote on the staffing plan and the budget. So that's sort of how the agenda went through. And so here are some of the things that we see, going back to that literature review. The first thing we see is insular recruitment. So the board chair, within the first minute of saying that she wanted to talk about an executive director position, shared with a group that she had actually identified a preferred candidate that she thought would be a great fit for this organization. So prior to even the organization sitting it down and thinking, what do we need the executive director for? Is this really a fundraising executive director? Is this an all-over executive director? You know, what are the key skills that this person needs to have? She said, we've got a candidate. This candidate was within the board chair's network, and we know that when we go within our network tends to look like us in many different aspects. And so this preferred candidate was a white woman, as were 4 of the 5 board members. So in addition to insular recruitment, we have this element of resource dependency that was sort of this thread running through it. So the board chair opened up the conversation by saying that she would have less time to give, and actually her new role might mean less money coming into the organization because of potential conflict of interest. So there was this priming effect of fear around resources. The staffing plan and the budget conversation happen sequentially, which makes sense from a management position. But the staffing plan is contingent on outside resources. So there was this element of fear and concern and uncertainty that is added into the mix that actually decreases the board's capacity to think critically. When we're scared about resources, we are not able to think as critically as we could if resources were not an issue. The board chair proposed a salary for the new executive director, which is, I think, $50,000. And then later on disclosed that she had actually already discussed the salary with the preferred candidate. And this actually had the effect of releasing a pressure valve on the board, because they're thinking, oh, 50,000 isn't enough. But hey, if we've got somebody who would be a good candidate who would be willing to do it for 50,000, there was a sigh of relief around resources. We also saw some evidence of moral licensing. I said earlier there was a Black Lives Matter sign in the window, and also the board chair in the conversation around the program coordinator had said we need to make sure we're hiring somebody who is a person of color. So the board is demonstrating at least the espoused value of social justice and equality, but that espoused value then gives the moral license to turn around and do something that maybe isn't quite as thorough or as thoughtful as they would normally think to be. So there is some evidence of moral licensing there. And then this white identity management piece, which if you haven't read this article, the 3D model of white identity management, I would encourage you to read it. It's fascinating. Basically, it says white people are doing one of three things in relationship to white privilege, and I would assume white supremacy at the same time. They're either denying it, they're distancing it, or dismantling it. This model says you're in one of three categories. I had a student do some research on this, and she found you actually can go back and forth in different categories. So it's a dynamic experience here. And so we looked at the data and tried to figure out, are we seeing any of these behaviors? And we didn't see any denying behavior. They were clearly open and recognizing this. In fact, social justice was something they talked about openly in the board meeting. But we did see some distancing. So the board used stereotypes around people of color, and they used their limited relationships of people of color to excuse the fact that they weren't opening up the hiring process to a broader network. The board talked vaguely about needing to build a pipeline of people of color, and what that does, it takes the pressure off of them in that moment to do something that would make sure this was a fair hiring process, and says, okay, we're going to put that over there. It's farther away from us. We don't need to worry about it. The board generated, but didn't solidify, a list of people of color and people of color focused organizations to send the job description to. So they had this conversation around who else could we send the job description to, but didn't actually finalize it, and ended up returning to this discussion of the preferred candidate. So again, you see this, hey, we're kind of doing this, but we're not really doing this. We're doing it enough to be able to say, hey, we're not promoting white privilege here, but oh, by the way, we're going to look at this candidate, preferred candidate. The board chair called for a vote on the proposal before solidifying a recruitment plan, and she used some subtle language shifts to acknowledge white privilege, but not address it. Like within the same sentence, she would go from acknowledging to dismissing it. And then the fact of them trying to hire a person of color for the program coordinator role actually is a form of distancing, because it's putting the person of color in a position that is of less authority than the executive director. Why wouldn't they try to do the same thing for the executive director? So that's a way of protecting and white privilege and distancing themselves from having to do any work around it. The only dismantling behavior was a repair attempt that was made by a board member of color and picked up by the program director. I'll talk about that in the next slide. So the repair attempt actually comes from John Gottman's work with his wife. I think her name's Julie, I forget. They are relationship psychologists. They do fascinating work, and they talk about when there is some sort of conflict or breach in the relationship, a repair attempt is a statement or action that prevents negativity from escalating out of control. It's an attempt to get back control and go, hey, let's get on the right track again. And in this particular meeting, the person of color reminded the group that they had already agreed it was important to hire people of color. So they reminding them of their core values, and then asked about this preferred candidate's race equity training. And so she's saying, hey, we got to think about this a little bit more here. The staff, who was also the board member, the program director, said, hey, it is worth casting a wider net. And then she asked this board member to continue to share her thoughts. So she's picking up on this repair attempt and then making sure that mic stays with the board member that's making that attempt and that the board's focusing on that. That then turned into that quick brainstorm around where else could we send the job description to, but it never actually went where it needed to go. And I'm realizing it's red, so let's keep going. Basically, there's a need for resources. We had all of these elements here. We had a repair attempt. It didn't work, and so we ended up with what is essentially an unjust or a racist hiring process, racist from the outcome perspective, not the intent perspective. You're on mute.
Thank you. The contributions are that it provides some of the micro and behavioral level origins of inequality and shows the role that resource scarcity creates because it devolves people's cognitive capacities. Let's see. So I think we'll end there, Jenny. We're at time now.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones and Dr. Castillo. That was really great. That's a wonderful study. And I do also want to acknowledge that qualitative work, because the data are textual, it does take longer to present. So I absolutely didn't want to cut you off in the middle of presenting that excellent data. And with that, thank you all for coming to this session. There's a lot of great sessions out there. And we really wanted to leave plenty of time, and we have it, to open it up to questions for our panelists. So if you'd like to type questions either in the chat box and I'll read them off, or unmute yourself and ask a question, I'll try to direct traffic as much as I can. Rachel.
Thank you all. I have a question for the last paper, which I've been thinking a lot about sort of researcher role in research. And I want to know, what did you do while you were sitting there listening to all this?
I didn't do anything. I just listened. Yeah, but it's a hard question. Yeah.
I imagine your eyes popped a little bit too. Dr. Zhao.
I have a question about the last paper. I find it's very relevant. I teach organizational behavior and we discuss diversity in class. I find this provide insights about why is this is the case. I wasn't very clear about the resource dependency point. Like, could you please elaborate how the resource dependency influence their hiring practices? Thank you.
Well, one of the things when the board chair said she was no longer going to have time, she also mentioned that that would likely mean a pulling back of a funding source. And so what we're hypothesizing is that perhaps that shifted them into this scarcity mentality, which meant that they had to go with something that was more secure and immediate versus something that was, you know, to them would have been harder to cast a wider net. Jenny, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, no, that's just it. That there was this scarcity of resources that undergirded the entire conversation that affected everything.
Yeah, this section of the paper really reminded me of some work that I did and published last year in Administrative Theory and Praxis on the economic pressures that are placed on nonprofit organizations to sort of concede to whiteness, and how whiteness creeps into the organization through these money sources. And once you start talking about the very subsistence of the organization, it's really easy to sort of threaten people into acquiescing to whiteness. I have a question here from, oh, go ahead, Dr.
Well,
Castillo.
I just wanted to weigh in because I think what we didn't get to cover at the end was the importance of developmental psychology as a potential antidote and intervention. And because people do have these cognitive biases, and under stressful situations, their cognitive capacity can get worse. And they limit what they actually are able to see and take hold of. Jenny's research really offers a way to broaden the scope. I think Gabriel's question was, how can we expand the capacity? What would be an intervention? And so things like creating a learning organization, but also helping, people develop reflective practice so they can become more self-aware and develop their regulatory capacity would be a couple of interventions.
So we have a question here for Dr. Mirabella and Dr. Carpenter. They asked what country context you explored in your study. And I also wanted to follow up with you mentioned this idea of indigenous ways of knowing. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more of that.
Absolutely. Heather, which one do you want to tackle?
Well, I can say that we didn't focus on one specific country. We focused on the world and the influence. It's not a study, it's a historical piece, and along with recommendations of the influence of Eurocentric North American influence on the education system and how it impacts the world, and how we're leaving out the indigenous populations in that perspective. So I'll let Roseanne talk on the indigenous ways of knowing.
Yeah, so I'm doing another study right now on sub-Saharan Africa. So I think some of our work is informed by that work because I'm thinking about that and looking at development programs in sub-Saharan Africa. But we're drawing generally from around the world, if you would, on this particular note. In terms of indigenous knowledge, what we're trying to do is sort of get into that and understand what that means. Also, how we can recommend. Of course, we're writing this, and Heather and I have talked about this all the time. We're writing this as white women from a minority nation, and we're talking about something that's taking place in another part of the world. But I have felt with my research increasingly, and this is my research on nonprofit management education, that I sometimes get quite angry and upset with my colleagues who go to other parts of the world, have a trip, and go teach somebody how to teach nonprofit management education in Kuwait or in whatever, as if you can pick up our stuff and just plop it down in another thing. So if anything, I think we're hoping to inform those conversations through this work so that we can be more aware of what we're doing as nonprofit educators. And like Heather said, and then I'll be quiet. When I first looked at sub-Saharan Africa for nonprofit programs, I couldn't find any. There wasn't anything like it. And then I found these development programs, which look a lot like nonprofit programs. In fact, Heather and I had this conversation just the other day. If you look at the curriculum, just substitute the word development and nonprofit and you've got the same curriculum, except their focus is on trying to get funds from the North, which is why they do it in that way. But so where did that curriculum come from? And so we're hoping to inform that. I hope that answers your question.
I also want to add that what we're reading, because this is a work in progress around indigenous ways of knowing, it tends to be counter to what we traditionally understand as higher education. And I don't mean to use that as a negative term. I mean, it is using intuition. It is oral oratory stories. It is and so and African nations, many of them have been trying to integrate this ways of knowing and knowledge into their higher education systems and fill this really hard pull from the UN development goals, from the World Bank, to go more back to the formal institutional ways of learning. So it's fascinating how they are trying to establish their own African institutions or higher education programs, but are really struggling integrating the two ways of learning and knowing, of the European centric with the credits and the degrees versus the more indigenous ways. And the scholars talk about that it's not necessarily like we tend to put weight on what is good and what is bad, or the fact that they're developing countries. So, oh no, they have to be developed. And so African scholars are arguing and saying, hey, no, we need to reassess how we're evaluating, how we're looking at this learning and education. So I'll be quiet now.
Thank you. Thanks. Any other questions from the audience right now? If not, I'll pose another one.
There's one in the chat.
Oh, yes. This is for Dr. Castillo and Dr. Jones. If you were not in the research role, what advice would you have given the board when they started to have this discussion?
I think sometimes just stepping back and say, what's happening here? Let me just paint the picture of what's happening. We said at the beginning this was the value, and yet here's the process that's happening. This particular board member said X, Y, and Z, and yet that wasn't really picked up in any meaningful way. And just presenting that, and then people are going to go, oh, let me rethink what's happening here. That would have been one potential one. I know Elizabeth mentioned a few earlier.
So I had a question. Oh, there's another question in the chat box. I'll ask this question and then I'll read it. I have a question for Dr. Zhao and Dr. Zhang, and that is, I was surprised the government sector had the largest pay gap of the three sectors, just because of how structured government pay usually is. And I wonder if that might I wonder what your hypothesis is then for what union involvement would do, because obviously that would create an even more highly structured pay structure. And why do you think the government pay gap was higher than the other two sectors?
Thank you. Can you repeat your point about union? Like, what was your question about the union?
Well, unions they increase this pay structure, right? They give you, oftentimes they negotiate strict formulas for pay structure, the same way that I perceive most governments do. So I wondered if how that would affect, how that related.
I was surprised to find this result as well. I needed to do more literature to try to have more conceptual knowledge to make sense of this. But one possible explanation is, for my study is individual level data. I don't have employer side data, which are key pay determinants as well, like their level of position. That's very key, right? So if white people are mostly in this managerial position, like higher positions in the government, and Black people are like lower level, that could create this huge pay disparity. My hypothesis for union is gonna reduce pay disparity, right? Because it bargains, it standardizes the pay level, and also for public workers. I'm a public employee. I work for public university, and our salaries are all public available, so everyone can check it. And my salary is the same with a white male colleague. Yeah. So I guess it has something to do with the level of positions that both white social workers and Blacks, like social workers of color, hold in government positions. And that's the limitation of quantitative study, right? I don't have the details of how this. I think we need more qualitative study to make sense of this result. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. We have a question in the chat for Dr. Marabella and Dr. Carpenter. And I think the brunt of it is that they'd like to hear more about what you see as the responsibility of global North / minority countries in rebuilding the systems of knowledge and knowing that were destroyed. And they had two thoughts. There is often talk about removing aid dependency, but shouldn't there be more responsibility to transfer more wealth to the global South? And two, can education be disconnected with global power dynamics where global South nations still have to demonstrate their worthiness to richer nations?
Great question, series of questions. So one of the things that's informing our work is this book called Unequal Partners, American Foundations in Higher Education and Development in Africa. And the philanthropists from the North went into Africa and they wanted to help out. And so they did a number of things. First of all, they really only funded programs that were in English. So I had talked about the Anglo-centric ways in which we've done this. And so that in and of itself put a lot of money into more of the English speaking institutions as opposed to other institutions, even that had Northern languages like French or Dutch. That was one thing. And so one of the things we could do as Arnova actually is have conversations with these philanthropists, right? We study them, we talk about them all the time, but we need to sit down with the philanthropists who are going and are doing that. And we need to provide them with this sort of information so that they can begin to understand that they're actually, I want to back up and just say, remember the book, remember the book, I'm looking at all you young people. Angie, you're going to remember this book, not that you're old, but just that you're a public administrator. Aaron Wildofsky's book, How Great Ideas in Oakland Get Dashed in Washington, right? I don't know if the rest of you are familiar with that, but the reality is that what we do here is not going to work in another culture. And what philanthropists here think is a good idea is it's not transferable. And that's what indigenous knowledge is. Indigenous knowledge says that when things are going to go well in the community, you have to work with the people who live in that community. And so I guess the answer to your question about we need to stand it on its head, because worthiness right now has to do with this excellence piece that I was referring to earlier. And that's a very minority world term.
Thank you. And I also thought about that book, Decolonizing Wealth, and I'm trying to remember who the author, but
Yeah.
Villanueva.
Yeah, it's on the floor right here.
Yeah, and that book really explodes this idea of what philanthropy means and what it could mean and how you can use philanthropy in a very different way. Thank you for that. I have one more question, and then I'll turn back to the chat. And this one's for Dr. Jones and Dr. Castillo. I study moral license. I've been doing experiments on moral license with nonprofit workers. One of my latest finding is that when nonprofit workers talk about their nonprofit before taking a racial index where they agree with statements that are more or less indicative of racism, that when they talk about their nonprofit, they indicate lower levels of racism, as would be indicated by your denial, right? The concept of denying the racism, but only when they talk about the nonprofits, leaving us to think, well, what's the true opinion? Right? But I've never seen someone tackle moral license in quite this way and not qualitatively, which I thought was fascinating. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, capturing that moral license qualitatively, and if you'd seen that other places.
Well, we were, so I have done another study on moral licensing as well from a quantitative perspective. I don't think I've ever seen it studied qualitatively, and I hadn't thought about that until you just said it. But it was something that did show up. There is another similar concept, and I'm forgetting the term of it, but I think it's moral congruency or something like that, where you want to keep your behaviors in line with what you said your behaviors are going to be. So it almost acts as like if moral licensing is you're going to act in the opposite way, this concept is you're going to act in the same way for the same reason. So interesting.
So I have Dr. Benenson's asked a question, and she's asking about the role of a researcher when they find themselves in that teachable moment, going back to that earlier, but not wanting to jeopardize the research. So, and she's asking what types of opportunities may exist. Jody, do you want to?
Oh, yeah, I can build on that. I've just been thinking about this a bit too, especially as I have been thinking about, as kind of Rachel pointed to, the role of the researcher when there might be varying power dynamics, or again, when we also think about the implications of value neutrality, like we were talking about a little earlier today. I just want to open it up to the group too, because I suspect many of us have been in situations like the one, Jenny, it sounds like, you were in, where we recognize that there might be things happening within an environment that we are wondering whether or not we should be intervening, because for all the reasons that we know we should not, air quotes, I guess, but what are the implications of not, right? And then what can we do? Where I'd be curious about what people think about this as a teachable moment, and or whether people have seen research approaches where we can, I guess, invite ourselves in for learning.
Action research. I think this is a good example. I don't know if you've heard of that before, Jody, but I think
yeah, absolutely. Mostly I'm thinking about participatory action research and other community-based action. We were talking about it earlier today too, and I'd be curious about kind of how this approach, I guess, maybe differed from that.
Yeah, I might be a bit of a chicken, but when I'm studying whiteness, I'm often looking for these moments. Like, these are the moments that I can piece apart as a sort of way to unveil the secret whiteness that's sitting just behind the mask. So do we have any other questions from the audience?
Nori?
Dr. Zhao.
This is not a question, but a comment, I guess. I agree with every point of the paper of Dr. Carpenter and Merit Valla, but as a person who came from the third world, I find it's deep rooted, the problem, and it's very tricky. People there, they value the knowledge and building more here. A person who get a PhD from the US get paid higher want to go back to China, I know, and the people who participate in a journal in the US, it's more valued than, when they publish in their own indigenous journals. I don't have an answer, just feel like this is a long way to go, a long road ahead of us. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and it's the same answer that Jenny and Elizabeth were talking about in their paper, right? So when you're up against these folks who aren't recognizing their own privilege and aren't recognizing how they're part of it, you sort of have to talk to them about it, but it's not easy. I would imagine, Jenny and Elizabeth, if you had opened up and given them a teachable moment, do you think they would have appreciated it, or do you think they would have thrown you out?
I think this is a group that would have appreciated the opportunity to do the self-reflection, but I think there was this train going on of need related to money and related to needing to have somebody in that position, especially if the board chair is now leaving and not going to do the work that the ED would have done,
Right.
that took over and prevented them from thinking critically in a way that they would have had that not been happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else have something they'd like to bring to the conversation, question or otherwise? Thank you, Dr. Zhao, also for offering that really interesting perspective.
I think it's great, Jody, the question, because in the comments about how people are saying that their fields or colleagues are not recognizing action research as valid research, I think this is deeply connected with all that we're talking about and the paper that Roseanne and I are doing, like on who gets to determine quality, what is quality and access to education. And so, I mean, like, yeah, and I have to say that we are involving some African scholars in reviewing it, and hope to be more inclusive in the future, because it's been very eye-opening for us as white women scholars to be writing on a subject that is emerging for us. So I want to acknowledge that, like,
Good point.
anyway. But
excellent point, Heather. Well, here's one thing we can do as Arnovans. When a colleague is having lunch with you next year when we're together, or you're just emailing each other and they're telling you that they're going over to, Kenya to teach them how to do nonprofit management education, tell them to take a deep breath and think about what they're doing and ask them what their approach is going to be. So I think we can start doing little things like that. And I've actually done that. Sometimes the response is not terrific, because part of this is our curiosity about the world, right? We want to go, they invite us, they're paying for us to go, you're going to give a talk, you're going to stay for a month. How lovely that is. But then what are we doing? And so we really have to think about what we're doing. And quite frankly, you're right, Ron, when you had said that they want you to come and they want to get the PhD, or they want to do this. But we have to change then what we're doing here, because if we bring doctoral students here, then we need to give them the curriculum that will make them successful in their own culture.
Roseanne, I'm going to take that invitation just to push a little bit. I study domestic context, but we do the same thing in our classrooms here when we tell our students that what we're teaching is what the marketplace rewards, and we prioritize that over lived experience and over what they see in their communities. Right. And I mean, I think bridging the two conversations, like participatory action research is a really great tool, but what happens when you came into the room without the understanding that you were going to you were a participant and now you're jumping in? And if we're going to behave, I think, in anti-racist ways, then we need to step out of those boundaries. Because I'm thinking about that board member who tried to intervene and nobody backed her up. And even if it hadn't gone her way, to have the validation of someone else in the room to say, like, yes, your point is valid, I think would have been a worthwhile endeavor. So, I mean, I feel uncomfortable saying it. I have like the heart beating fast moment of like, am I breaking some norm here? But I feel like I know who I'm talking to in this room. So I feel like it's an okay thing to say.
Well, Rachel, yay!
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a perfectly okay thing to say.
Thank you for that conversation. That's a really interesting point, Rachel, and you're absolutely right, especially about the domestic context. Thank you for all of our panelists today. Thank you so much. Congratulations, the diversity scholars who are in the room, Fahad, Samantha, Paul. We're so glad to have you here. Dr. Eikenberry, congratulations for your presidency. And congratulations to all of our panelists. Really great work. Our time is up. If you want to stick around,